In this video, we continue our examples working with branching statements in C++. At the end of the last video, we did an example that contained both an if statement and an else statement. And the purpose of the program we were looking at was to determine the pay a worker would get based on the number of hours that they worked. For this example, we considered two situations. One case where the number of hours worked was less than or equal to 40, in which case the worker received their hourly rate for each hour worked, and an overtime case, where the worker received time and a half for all hours over the first 40 hours worked. However, this program may not always work as we intend it to work. To see this, let's actually open the program in Visual Studio. So here is that program in Visual Studio where we have the ability to execute our code. And let's see what happens when we input a number of hours worked that is less than 40, where we might get a counterintuitive response. And the situation that I'm thinking of is if our user were to either accidentally or maliciously enter a negative number of hours that they worked. For example, if the worker says that they worked -1 hour, it tells us that their weekly pay is -15.75. Now, this may or may not be the response that you would like, but my personal opinion is that this is not the response that we would like. In the event that the user enters a negative number of hours, I would like to say perhaps that their pay is 0 and assume that the user made a mistake, rather than say that somehow the user owes their work environment $15.75. So let's take our code that we have right here that had an if statement and an else statement, and let's modify it to think about the case where the user enters a negative number and have the program behave in a more appropriate manner in that situation. The code that is now up on the screen shows how we can modify our previous code to take into consideration the possibility that the worker has entered a negative number of hours. We have changed the code from our previous version to now have our primary if statement first ask if the number of hours worked is less than 0 in line 14. In this situation, we aren't going to compute a value to reassign to the pay variable declared in line 13 at all, but rather, in the situation where the worker enters a negative number of working hours, we will simply print to the screen that there has been an error. What was previously our if statement has now become an else if statement on line 18. It now checks if the hours worked is less than or equal to 40, and our else statement from before remains our else statement and now appears on line 22. That's an overview of the modifications we've made. What I'd like to do now to make sure we understand is walk through the flow of control of this program and highlight one or two subtleties, particularly concerning the else if statement. So the flow of control of our program begins on lines 7 through 13, and the block of code that is highlighted will be executed sequentially in all situations. In line 11, hours worked is input by the user, and after lines 7 through 13 are executed, line 14 will be executed in all situations, checking if the hours worked is less than 0. Should the hours worked variable input by the user actually be a negative number, we will execute the block of code in lines 15 through 17, printing our error message. And after printing our error message, the flow of control will move outside of the block in lines 15 through 17, picking up at the end of the branching statement with line 27, printing out the weekly pay. Now, in this situation, where line 14 evaluated to true, we haven't changed the value stored within our pay variable from line 13, and we initialized our variable pay in line 13 to be a value of 0. So in the situation that line 14 evaluates to a true statement, what is printed in line 27 will be a value of 0.0 for pay. However, it is possible and in fact preferable for the user of our program to have actually worked some number of hours in a week. So we are hoping that line 14 of our program actually turns out to be a false statement and that the user of the program entered some number of hours that was greater than or equal to 0.0. If that is the case, and line 14 evaluates to false, the flow of control will instantly move to line 18 to perform our next check. The else-if statement on line 18 is now checking if hours worked is less than or equal to 40. There is no explicit check here that the number of hours worked is also greater than 0. And yet, if the flow of control ever reaches line 18, then it must be the case that the number of hours worked is greater than or equal to 0, because the flow of control will never reach line 18, as we just saw, if the number of hours worked is less than 0.0. So should the flow of control ever reach line 18, we know for a fact that the number of hours worked is greater than or equal to 0. Therefore, the check on line 18, even though it doesn't say that it's checking for both of those conditions, is in fact checking for both of those conditions. This is probably the biggest sticking point of this whole line of code and a very important thing to know about if-else-if statements. From line 18 onward in the code that we have presented on the screen, flow of control is very similar to what it was in the previous videos. In the event that line 18 evaluates to a true statement and the number of hours worked is less than or equal to 40, and also greater than 0, we will enter the block of code in lines 19 through 21 computing pay via the formula hourly rate times number of hours worked. After computing the block of code in lines 19 through 21, the flow of control would again resume after the branching statement at line 27, printing out the weekly pay. In the event that line 18 evaluated to a false statement and the number of hours worked is not less than or equal to 40, the flow of control will move to our else statement in line 22, and the program reaching line 22 indicates that we know that the number of hours worked is greater than 40. In this situation, the block of code in lines 23 through 25 is executed, and we use our overtime formula for computing hourly pay. Upon executing the block of code in lines 23 through 25, flow of control again reaches line 27, printing out our weekly pay in all situations. That concludes this example using if, else if, and else statements in C++.